All right, hello everybody. Welcome. Good evening. Thanks for joining us today. I know we have people online as well on Zoom. My name is Steve Hoyer. I'm the executive director of the NYU Brademas Center here at NYU. So it's my pleasure today to welcome you to Inside American Politics, a series designed to give students unique access to political experts and provide an insider's view of the American political system. So tonight we're joined by an incredible panel of experts. The panel that is coming out right now. They've done a lot for NYU over the years. They've interacted with NYU students, participated in a lot of conferences. So big thanks to them. I'm going to give them a brief introduction. Stephanie Cutter, a Democratic political strategist, founder of Precision Strategies, former deputy campaign manager and senior advisor to President Obama. Stephanie's coming in. We have Kevin Madden, senior partner at Penta and former senior advisor for Romney for president in both 2008 and 2012. And Eugene Daniels, co-author of Playbook and White House correspondent for Politico, as well as the 2025 president of the White House Correspondent Association. So the panel is going to be talking about the first 100 days of the new administration, reflecting on how it's unfolding, what's to come, and they're going to talk about what they really want to talk about. They're all old friends. With that, I'll turn it over to Steve McMahon. And Steve is the co-founder of Purple Strategies, and he's a longtime friend of NYU. So I'll turn it over to you,
Seth.
Steve.
There's
Thank
my
you.
man Seth, right? Seth and I taught together for many years until I abandoned the practice, but I'll be back. So thank you all for coming. And Seth, thank you for being here. I know your class is here, so I hope you guys are ready with some questions, right? Not right this second. So we're going to talk a little bit about the first 100 days, but in order to understand the first 100 days, you probably have to understand some of the things that came before it. And in particular, the kind of Trump presidency that we all experienced from 2017 to 2020. And I think he felt a little constrained by his staff and aides who would walk things back or water things down or say that's not really what he meant or what he intended. And it just feels like there's no constraint now. Does anybody disagree with that?
I think that's right.
Okay. Including, by the way, an attack on the free press, which I've never seen before. Eugene, the $8.2 million that the government paid Politico. You have anything you want to say about that?
I do not, but that's not how it happened.
So what happened? So seriously, what happened? So this is, today the White House apparently went after government subscriptions that are paid to outlets like Politico and floated a number, I think, of $8.2 million, which they said they're going to take back.
Mm-hmm. So Politico...
Kind of a case study of like how something with a little tiny of truth just gets blown up with misinformation.
How quickly it goes through. So Politico Pro is our subscription service at Politico. And, Purple Strategies probably subscribes, and you pay for that service. And if you go, it's in the back end. You get a lot of access to things that folks can't get on the free site. You get... my favorite part of it is all the emails for members of Congress's staff, which is very helpful. So that's what Politico Pro is, and that's what the subscription service is. And different agencies within the government, because they like to have more information when they're in the government, have subscribed to that. They did it during the Trump administration. They did it during the Biden administration. And this week, there was a snafu with payment that started a conspiracy theory that we were connected to U.S. aid, and then that's kind of how it bubbled online. But it is not true that the government has been paying and giving political grants to do anything, ever.
I'm shocked that the Trump administration would say or do anything that's not true, but we'll come back to that. The reason I mentioned the previous administration and the fact that the president now seems completely untethered by any kind of restraint is because I think it's important for us to understand the moment we're in. It's 16 days into the presidency now, and I think the number of outrages probably exceeds one a day. But I wanted to start with what do you think is the most disturbing thing? I'll start with Stephanie and then Kevin and Eugene. What do you think is the most disturbing thing that the Trump administration has done in the first 16 days?
Well, it's kind of hard to pick. I mean, there are various things that he's done that have various consequences. the federal government putting out a memorandum halting all funding going out is unprecedented. And it has a downstream impact that we don't even know yet. But, I'm seeing reports of community health centers that are closing because they can't get access to their funding that they were contracted for by the federal government. Medicaid programs, Head Start programs, kids going without school lunch, all of these things are real life impacts. I would say that. I would say his comments last night on Gaza are beyond anything that I can imagine any president saying, that we're going to take over this piece of land that has been fought over and subject to, great distress for the people living there for a very long time, not to mention the current war that they're going through, and not think that there's not ramifications for the United States and its security. It was just completely irresponsible. But, that is an area where they did walk that back pretty quickly today. So, he puts out these trial balloons and waits to see the reaction. And if outrage becomes too great, he pulls it back, at least temporarily. So those would be the two things that I would point out so far. But
I'd say, first I would have said, if you asked me this question a week ago, I would have said the 14th Amendment and the birthright citizenship. That not being poorly, the executive order not being very well thought out, and then also the fact that it's just going to lead to an incredible amount of litigation and they'll probably lose. And then I would say the secondary, sort of 1B, would be the USAID furlough of all the employees. And then, similar to what Stephanie said, the downstream effect of what these dollars, the impact that it has across not only communities in the U.S., because I think there's even some aid dollars out there that are tied to agriculture communities and farmers and things like that, but also just the effect it has on U.S. smart power around the globe and how we're trying to project stability and trying to project partnerships around the globe, and then what that does when those dollars fall away and medicine doesn't get to people and researchers aren't getting dollars, and then also development programs are not getting those dollars. That actually has a destabilizing effect, and then it also eventually those type of, avian flu, Ebola, those type of things can actually come to our shores and have a destabilizing effect on us here at home. So not very well thought out, planned, or executed, and as a result, I think, we got a little bit ahead of our supply lines on that.
As a lone reporter on him, I'm going to ignore his question about what I found disturbing and talk about the thing that I think that you said that I have found most interesting about the staff that the president has put around him is making sure that the folks around him either, one, are true believers in the kinds of things that he wants to do, right? We've been talking in the media, and everyone has about, these loyalty tests, people that really believe in the things that he said and promised, both before in 2015 that he wasn't able to do, and in the 2024 election. But there's also a set of people who kind of don't see it as staff's jobs to stop things from happening, right? You had folks during the first administration who would take things off of his desk so he wouldn't sign them, right? They would slow walk things so much so within agencies so that they wouldn't happen, and they would hope that he would forget about it because there was so much going on. That's not happening anymore, right? The folks around him see it as their job to make sure the things that he promised over the election actually happen, right? And you can see that with DOGE, right? That they are working on the things that he promised. You can see that today when he signed the executive order about women and girls in sports and trans girls and women not being able to play in those sports. Those are things that he promised that he's working on. A lot of these things, when you talk to folks either around the administration or within the administration, some of these things they know it's going to go to court and they're going to lose. Yeah. But they want people people to see them fighting. They want his base to see him doing it. And then at the end of the day, if the 14th Amendment comes back and it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, we've talked about this before, we've ruled on this before, it's in the Constitution, it's constitutional, then they can say, one, we tried, and two, the deep state is trying to stop us, right? And so there's really no there's no adverse effect to him and the administration if these things don't go through, because his base will believe kind of what he says when he says it. If he says the deep state try to stop them, then they are going to believe that because they believe in him, not as opposed to like the policy prescriptions that he and his and the campaign talked about.
And to that point too, they also kind of bait their most active opponents into over-indexing on their response, right? So, here we are, where we have trillions of dollars in government spending, and the examples that are being trotted out are, $30,000 grants that are going to, diversity, a DEI program in Colombia. And people come out and reflexively try to defend that or try to explain it or put it into context at a time where context, explanation, nuance, like, you lose the debate if you're trying to advance on those attributes or principles, and like they kind of, works in their favor. So you're right, yeah.
And it's Steve Bannon 101, right? He has said this over and over again. To flood the zone is the term that he uses, and that you give them us, all of us, so much to focus on in one day that you can't. The stuff that they really want done, you can't pay attention to, and that's something that everyone has to deal with. The Democrats that are going to struggle to figure out what's the thing they actually focus on. The thing they probably should focus on is the prices, right? And the reason that Trump won the election, the reason that Vice President Harris lost it was about prices in this country. And they should probably stay focused on this. And the other stuff, while very important, right, is at sometimes a bit of a distraction to keep them off their game a little bit.
The only thing I would say to that's slightly different from what you're saying is that a lot of what he's doing will end up in the courts. And I think that they are purposeful in doing that, because let's remember when he was president the first time, they did stack the courts at the appellate level. And if they can get these cases going, they have a much bigger agenda here in terms of the power of the presidency. And you can see that with what they're doing with federal agencies. They have no power to abolish the Department of Education. They have no power to put USAID under the State Department or to get rid of all of its employees. These are congressionally mandated departments, and it's federal law. He can't break federal law just because he feels like it. It's going to end up in court. And I think if they do enough of these in different jurisdictions, it's going to make its way up to the Supreme Court. And one of these cases, he's going to win. And that creates a precedent that builds his power. So there is a legal strategy here that they are fully aware of. And birthright citizenship is a good example of that. There is legal literature out there that birthright citizenship isn't constitutional or it's being misinterpreted. And there are lots of people on his team who...
Stephanie, I don't mean to interrupt, but could you just explain...
What birthright citizenship is?
Could you explain birthright citizenship, the 14th Amendment, and this other body of writing out there, and why some people believe that this is a legitimate legal debate?
14th Amendment.
You remember this? You remember this from Georgetown Law School?
Yes, barely.
They probably remember it better.
I mean, I do remember the 14th
I took the
Amendment.
LSATs once.
I Googled the LSAS.
Part of the birthright, part of the 14th Amendment is, says that if you are born in this country, you are granted citizenship. And part of that was, the reason for that was coming out of the abolishment of slavery, that people who were enslaved but were born here, they were granted citizenship as a result of the 14th Amendment. There is a theory that if you are born in this country but your parents are not legally in this country, then that citizenship does not extend to you. That obviously is not true, because that would then defeat the whole purpose of birthright citizenship in the first place and the reasoning behind it. So, but this is a real thing that some people think that, including many people around the president. So that's why they are testing this. And it used to be, the outrage around anchor babies.
Yep.
And now it's moved to birthright citizenship, which is the underlying right for somebody born in this country to be granted citizenship. So, so it's going to make its way through the courts. You can, where is it being brought first? Because the judge said something.
Well, it was a Maryland judge today.
A Maryland judge today
but there were
said.
it was in California as well. So there's a little bit of smart lawyering.
Yes.
On the side of the folks who are challenging
Filing
this.
these cases. You have to really think about where you file the cases to figure out how it's going to move up to the Supreme Court, because this will end up at the Supreme Court. So both of these judges who have heard the case have said at the beginning, I'll hear the case, but I'm going to tell you how I'm going to rule. This is an outrageous claim that they're making. This is a constitutional right. So, but it'll get appealed. It will make itself its way up to the Supreme Court.
And the strategy that Stephanie's talking about has worked in the past, right? The immunity case that he brought up to the Supreme Court, every person on the left and the right and the center who was a legal expert that I spoke with, a lot of my colleagues spoke with, said, one, the Supreme Court will never take this up. That'd be crazy that anyone would think that, they would give a president much more immunity than we already think about. And then when it went to the Supreme Court, everyone told us that wasn't going to happen, but it did, right? And so now he and every president after him has much more immunity than I think a lot of folks ever thought that the presidency would hold. And so I think what they learned from that is that testing the bounds of the legal process is good strategy. And, other presidents, President Biden, for example, one of the complaints that I heard from Democrats all the time, from the left all the time, was why doesn't he just sign the executive order instead of telling us that it's not going to make it through the courts, right? Let's test that theory. And that's what a lot of Democrats wanted him to do. But Trump is the only president who's ever been like, you know what, whatever, we'll see if it actually works. And sometimes it works out for him.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a minute about the courts, because one question that I have is, and so you've got the 14th Amendment case, and there's going to be a whole bunch of others. But let's take USAID for a second. The president goes ahead and he says, if you work at USAID, you're furloughed, you're out. And it goes to court. And, courts don't always move really quickly. And so all those USAID employees who are furloughed or fired or go find other jobs, even if they win in court, will they be able to come back and reconstitute USAID? And if they lose, if the Trump administration loses in court, what happens if they just ignore it? And by the way, there's a legal question, what happens, but politically also what happens. Kevin, you obviously
sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, but so you speak to Republicans on the Hill, elected officials up there. Eugene, you interview them all the time. It sort of feels like they're waiting for some cover to take this president on, but will they?
I don't think they're waiting to pick. They're hoping that they don't ever have to take him on. Yeah, I think, I'll take a step back, because I'm not smart enough, as smart as Stephanie on the legal stuff, so I can just talk the real raw dumb politics that I understand. But that's it. I mean, the thing that you have to understand is how strongly this administration feels that they have a mandate. Now, I think they've overinterpreted that mandate. It was still a pretty close election. Mandates are elusive, and I am a firm believer that public opinion is never an event, it's always a process. So enjoy your moment on election day, but the process of keeping that political coalition together and keeping momentum on policy so that those coalitions of white working class voters and others, Latinos that came together, are still happy. That's a much tougher job, but they do believe that they have this huge mandate, and that's why they're moving quickly, to Stephanie's point, strategically to overwhelm and confuse their opposition. And I think they also know that when you have a president who is technically a lame duck, that'll probably be something that we get into a fight with in 2 years from now too, but that they really have a very small window to act, and that they're doing it with reckless abandon. And I think they would view reckless abandon as not an insult. They would see it as, yes, it is part of their strategy. And so I think that is it. And the folks on Capitol Hill, they don't want to take them on. They're not looking for an opportunity. They're hoping that this political cover exists as far as they can, as far into the future as possible. Because their most active vocal base back home wants them to support the president.
And frankly, a lot of the things that he's doing are conservatives have wanted to do for a long time, right? The idea that we're giving too much money to foreign countries is a thing that has been a part of conservative thought in the conservative movement for a long time. The idea that the Department of Education needs to go away is something that has been a part of the conversation for a long time. It's the process that I think when I talk to Republicans on the Hill that they're worried about, right? It's like it's moving too fast.
Yeah.
The involvement of, you know, someone who's unelected and really doesn't kind of work for the government and Elon Musk and Doge and that government agency that's not a part of the government making these decisions, going into these spaces, demanding to look at documents and get into the intricate access points in these organizations. That's what they're worried about. But if folks are expecting Republicans, a bunch of Republicans on the Hill to like stand up and say, no, I don't think that's going to happen this time around. I think we've seen that, you know, over and over and over again. We've seen it again in the Senate as his kind of some of these picks like Tulsi Gabbard or RFK has started to move through the process where it looked like maybe they weren't going to get through, but now it seems like they are because Republicans are scared of his base and they know that they need him, right? Like at the end of the day, it is his Republican Party. The first time around in 2015 and 2016, there was a hope, I think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, in the Republican Party and the Republican leadership, elected leadership, that it was that you guys were going to go back to the Bush, the Mitt Romney Republican Party, but like that is over, right?
Yeah,
I think
that
that is really settling in, and that's how people are acting and behaving, knowing that this is a Trump.
To your
party.
point, I think just real quickly, the most motivating aspect, even for centrist moderate Republicans all the way to the most extreme MAGA Republicans, is they love the taste of liberal tears. And that is keeping them together in this moment. The downside risk is that none of this is addressing the main reason that they won big in November, which is inflation in the economy.
Right.
And so we're 6-9 months away from maybe the inflation and economic sort of, you know, maybe it's stickier than we think and it's not being brought down, and like the political fortunes will and sort of parameters with which we have this debate will shift pretty quickly.
The parameters are going to shift a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, Elon Musk is not doing the president any favors. His unpopularity is now approaching high 60s, 70s. And that's going to transfer over to the president. And right now, all of this stuff that's happening, you know, we're only 2 weeks in, which is incredible. But this
Every
otherwise.
week is a month.
Yeah.
Every month a year.
But the reason they rescinded that memo, that budget memo, halting all federal funding, is because they heard from Republican governors and Republican senators to say that somebody at home couldn't get their money for X, Y, and Z. So they did speak up about that. And as soon as Donald Trump's numbers start tanking, and they will, because that's the nature of politics these days. I don't care who the president is. I'm not making a partisan statement. This is a reality. And they see the president as a drag on their reelections, then they will start speaking up. And his political power is not set in stone. It will weaken over time. Department of Education is a good example. Conservatives don't like the Department of Education. They think that education should be handled at the local level. Well, the reason it's handled at the federal level is because depending upon the state and the locality, the way to pay for it is really hard. It's taxes. And if you live in a certain district with higher taxes, your schools are better compared to living in, you know, a less wealthy area and you're paying taxes and your schools suck. And people aren't happy, won't put up with that. The other thing is Pell Grants, student loans, special ed funding, ensuring that all kids have access to go to school. regardless of your circumstances. Those things are only kept equal to the extent that you believe that they're equal with the federal government involved. So I know this from the campaign and even current polling, abolishing the Department of Education is really unpopular, with the exception of a faction of the MAGA base. So once they start dismantling these programs, people are going to feel it. People aren't going to like it. School systems aren't going to like it. They're going to start speaking up, and it trickles up. Same thing when they start going to renew the president's tax cuts. And as a result, have to cut the budget. There are very few places you can cut the budget. That's because of the way our budget is set up. And it's mostly entitlements, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, defense spending. Those are the big four that you can really cut from. You touch any one of those things, and it is a firestorm. And it's not a political fire. I mean, it doesn't come from one party. It comes from everybody. So that's why we haven't seen a budget. That's why the reconciliation process in the House and Senate hasn't started to move yet, because Republicans can't figure out how to move the president's agenda without screwing themselves. So that's what we're currently faced with. And Republicans will put up with it, elected Republicans will put up with that just for so long. But once those numbers start to drop, we will be hearing from them.
Let me put a finer point on my question. If a court says that what you're doing is illegal, does anybody here believe that Donald Trump and his administration will stop doing it?
No. I think you also have to look at the track record that he's established. I mean, he's had legal legal action directed at him from state level, federal level, you name it, and he has survived. And I mean, the way I try to pose this to people all the time is like, well, what would you do if everybody came at you and you were the sort of like at the federal level and state level, and you survived all of it, and your best friend also happens to have $400 million? Like, how would you, or 400 billion? Sorry, how would you act? I was like, I'd be pretty like, hey, DGAF, you know. And so, what's the political version of DGAF right now when it comes to advancing on priorities on Capitol Hill, advancing on priorities with the public, and then taking on his enemies? Like, that's really the attitude that you're seeing. And you know, every step of the way, I grew up in New York, so I've been sort of I've had Donald Trump ever since birth. And one of the things I've always tried to tell people is that, like, you know, he doesn't have the same level of consciousness that we do. Like, he doesn't have a level of shame. And so, like, what would you do if you could, for example, like if you were to just transfer this to diet, like what would you do if you knew you could eat anything you wanted but you never gained any weight? Like, you'd be pretty reckless as well. Like, we'll try to transfer that to Donald Trump's thinking, which is like, they came after me in the courts, they didn't get me, I'm elected president again, and my best friend has $400 billion. So it's like, that's it.
And he's gonna build a hotel in Gaza.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thinking.
Yeah.
Nobody in their right mind would think that that is a good idea or strategy. But Donald Trump does, because DGAF.
Did you have anything you want to? Do you think, based on the conversations that you have with administration officials, if a court ruled, no, you can't do that, is there anybody around Donald Trump who would say, you know, you really can't do that?
I think he's going to test whether or not people like Pam Bondi, his attorney general who was sworn in today in the Oval Office, whether or not they are going to do that. And if you talk to anyone who was an attorney general for Donald Trump in the past, they know how painful it is and what he kind of forces them to do and say. You can ask them, and it's hard to find some of them because they are no longer in politics anymore. And so it is hard to see people push him that hard as they were trying to do in that first administration. I'm sure there's someone that's going to do it. Is it going to get to Donald Trump? Is he going to care? Is he going to see that as disloyal and then send them on their way? Those are the real questions. Not if someone is going to do it. Is if they do, what happens to them afterward, and whether that he actually understands or cares that that's their advice. Because at the end of the day, they do feel like they have this mandate. And I was speaking with someone the day before the inauguration, who had just talked with a bunch of folks that were going into his Department of Justice, and they said that they were going to stretch the limits of everything, right, from the legal to the cultural to the political, over and over and over again, because they feel like they have this mandate. They feel like the culture is with them, which Republicans haven't really had before, right? You have a lot of Republicans who are like, it's cool to be a Republican now,
Yeah,
right?
there's like they do believe that there's a cultural tipping point in their favor.
Right, which is different. And right now, frankly, like the Democrats aren't really, they don't have a clear kind of strategy on what they're going to do, what they're going to focus on. At some of these protests over the last couple of days, you can see some of the cringy videos online of some of the chants that have been thrown out, and it's some of it just seems unfocused.
Yeah.
And that is something that the party's going to have to figure out. It's not going to be, the new DNC chair that's going to do that, right? People are going to look to the elected leaders on Capitol Hill to do that. And at this point, there's no clear strategy on how to fight back. So that means that if there's no resistance, if the resistance is exhausted, if the elected Democrats aren't going to do anything, then why should he feel like he's going to be stopped? That there's going to be a lot of folks, with some jurisdiction over the kinds of things that he's going to do. In his head, double down, triple down, and you benefit from that kind of behavior. That's how he thinks, and that's how the folks around him have started to believe about that as well, because it's worked out over and over and over again for him.
So Stephanie, you were very close to the last campaign, Kamala Harris's campaign, right inside the middle of it, the boiler room. As you think about the issues that made the biggest difference in that campaign, and Kevin mentioned the economy and inflation, those are obvious. On our side, it seemed like we had this argument on democracy and choice. I think immigration probably hurt more than helped. But as you think about the landscape and what produced a victory for Trump, what do Democrats need to do going forward differently or the same? And do you think resistance by itself is enough, or do Democrats need to do more, and what should they do?
Well, there are a million questions in there.
I'm sorry, but
Let me take the election first. So I was not involved in the Biden campaign. I agreed to help the vice president because she is a friend. And it was just a 3-month sprint. And the numbers on the economy were, they would have killed anybody, any candidate. And she was able to close the gap with him pretty significantly, but we just couldn't get it over the top. There were other issues, immigration being one of them. And he went hard at her on the trans issue. Democracy was largely a Democratic issue. It was not a motivator for independence. But if the immigration issue was really for the independence that we needed to win, it was more of a symbol of the country being out of control. And the current administration, which would have been the Biden-Harris administration, let it get out of control. But people, they were giving a larger sense of that we were going in the wrong direction, things are out of control, we need to make a change. Over the top of that is really the economy and costs, and inflation is a big sign that things were out of control. So that's the issue that drove the election, which was a very close election, for a 3-month sprint. It wasn't a mandate, but it was clear. And the fact that so many states went to Trump is, that tells you that there was no one thing, that it was a wave election against the sitting administration. So what do Democrats do now? I think they need to pick their battles. I would advise against going outside of USAID and protesting. As much as I believe in USAID, that's not the way to fight it. The way I would fight it is getting a bunch of generals to talk about the necessity of soft power in securing the safety of this country. So they have to be smart about the fights. When we get to the fight over the tax cuts and the budget and things like that, it'll be much easier for them because then they can put a face on who's paying for that tax cut for Elon Musk and, you know, the president's billionaire friends. And the more they can put Elon Musk and the other billionaires that were on stage at his inauguration out front, and pointing out that the people who actually voted for him, thinking that he was going to help them, are being left behind because they're paying for those tax cuts for the billionaires. Or they're going without their health care so that these billionaires can get tax cuts. Or their road's not going to get fixed so these billionaires can get tax cuts. You can see where I'm going with this. I could give you a million examples. But they need to be smart about it. For USAID, I would do like field hearings, lifting up the people that will be impacted, like farmers who supply all that grain to countries that USAID services, or public health officials who can talk about if we don't stop polio over there or smallpox over there, it's coming here. And that's a way to make a case for it versus just pure resistance. So they have to be smart about it. And the way they handled it 4 years ago, was it just 8 years ago, is not the way the country's going to react this time, because Trump has been normalized. There's, you know, his outrageous behavior is not seen as outrageous as it was back then.
That's probably one of the most important points, just to emphasize it. My son voted for the first time this year. He was 18, and he voted for Trump. And, you know, it's kind of like, for me, as a Romney Republican, I kind of really wanted to focus group that, you know? But for me, Trump is a sort of attack on the sort of traditional Republican sort of principles and going away from it. And for my son, Trump, the political system that he is now witnessing and participating in, it's always had Trump in it. And so a lot of the reporting and a lot of the strategists and a lot of the people who are trying to position the Democratic Party are all trying to make it how this is like this terrible, outrageous, like, move away from the norms. But you have to realize there's an entire audience out there that the Trumpification of politics has been around. This is it. This is normal for them. This is the standard. And so I know that's hard for people to admit and hard for people to accept, but I think you have to have some element of acceptance of this is the way politics is now, if you're going to advance on new changes and new ways to motivate people and mobilize people and activate them to take them on in the future.
Stephanie raised something, and I wanted to get Eugene and Eugene's reaction, but also Kevin, yours. She talked about the billionaires and the working class all part of the same coalition. And I think it was Steve Bannon who pointed out that, when you have billionaires that are surrounding the president and driving so much of the president's policy and the administration policy, and you've got these working people who voted for him, thinking that this guy was going to represent and their values and fight for them. How long is it before those fissures start to become a lot more problematic for that coalition? And what's going to happen? I mean, predict the future. So, Eugene, you talk to these guys. The H-1B visa is a great example. So a lot of the working class folks that voted for Trump, think immigration is a big problem, and Trump says he's going to build a wall and keep everybody out. And then Elon Musk and all the tech guys say, yeah, well, wait a minute. Our engineers come from other countries. They're really smart, so they should be able to come in. And I don't know that the MAGA Republican believes that. I'm not sure they're aware of it yet. What happens when those two things start knocking on each other?
I mean, I think Stephanie's point earlier, the taxes, right? When there is when folks are able to really focus on what's happening on Capitol Hill about the tax cuts, what that's going to look like, that's when you're going to see some of those fissures really show up. I've been talking to Republicans on the Hill, and many of them have remarked at how different the coalition of the Republican Party is, and that if they're able to hold that and continue with those folks, that will change politics forever. If they're able to keep and continue to grow more Black people voting for Republicans, more Latinos voting for Republicans, if that more young people voting for Republicans, if that continues, I don't know how the Democrats battle that, right? Because now you're creating this kind of patchwork of a party that really used to be how the Democratic Party operated, right? Just a lot of different people, a much larger tent. But to do that, Republicans have to operate in a way that is anathema to some of them, right? You're talking about these tax cuts and like, okay, so we really have to center those working class people. Where are the conversations with them? And some of the Republicans on the Hill are saying that. They're saying very behind the scenes to the president and his team, and especially to Speaker Mike Johnson, hey, when we do this, we have a chance here to focus on the people that put us here, right? And not to go back to the old ways of doing things. But then at the same time, you're gonna have the Elon Musk. I was at the inauguration, there weren't a lot of us because it was in the rotunda at the Capitol. And it was wild to see, those billionaires in front of members of this cabinet, right? That is not something that you normally see. And so what that says is their ability to access the president and his inner circle is much bigger than the members of Congress, much bigger than maybe some of the cabinet secretaries, and definitely bigger than some of the working class folks who put him back into the White House. And so they're gonna be whispering in his ear at the same time as, we're gonna be talking to these working class people about how they feel about some of these tax cuts. When that OMB directive that memo came down that night and the next day, when there was so much confusion, you saw, people who voted for Donald Trump on TikTok, or I saw it on Instagram Reels because I'm a millennial, and that's where you see those kind of videos for me, or X. And they were crying because they were like, I benefit from these kinds of things. And what was shocking is that the Democratic Party didn't pounce on that, right? And so if there's no one to pounce on it, right? Let's say, that's something
They
like
did
that.
eventually.
They did eventually, but the speed at which it happened in the world that we live in wasn't fast enough, right? And so if there's no one to pounce on these things and bring them up, then maybe it won't matter, but I think those fissures are going to be huge and big. And I think if the Democrats do it right, it's going to be much more obvious. And more importantly, I think what people fail to understand about Donald Trump is he is moved by public opinion. One of the reasons they walked back that memo was because they saw how bad it was playing out in the public. And so he is moved by that. When he did that interview with Kristen Welker on Meet the Press, he talked about the mass deportations, and he talked about how bad it would look if they were pulling, the video of, he had this woman in his head who was getting pulled out and thrown into a van, right? So he said that's gonna be bad for us. So he does think about those things in a way I think that people maybe think that he doesn't. And so that public opinion is gonna be key to how he then tells the Republicans, actually, I don't like the billionaire tax cut, let's move over to the other side, because they have a chance to build their base and expand their base in a chance that the Republicans haven't had in a really long time.
Eugene makes a really good point too, and I think at the end of the day, he just what gets him good press, and like how's it playing out on the cable shows, and he sort of reads and reacts to that. I think to your other point though, which is how are the Democrats going to play this? I think right now they're playing it very poorly, and there's no sign that they're getting it right. But they're still we're only 2 weeks in, so that's not really harsh criticism as much as it's reflexive criticism of the moment. But I think the billionaire boogeyman thing is a bad strategy, and it's not going to work. Before it was Elon Musk, it was the Koch brothers. Before it was the Koch brothers, it was the U.S. Chamber. Blah blah blah. I mean, like private equity with Mitt Romney, and like I don't think that necessarily has the enduring sort of success that they think it does. I think politics is very simple when you break it down to what did we win and how do we keep it? What did we lose? How do we get it back? And the key for Democrats right now is What did they lose and how did they get it back? And it is Latinos and working class voters. And it really does come down to the central question is in this election, they lost the fundamental question, who's on my side? They didn't feel like Kamala Harris was on their side. They didn't feel like Joe Biden understood them, and they felt the country was going in the wrong direction, and he represented the past versus the future. Donald Trump, for whatever his talents are, his main talent is, he often benefits from incompetent opposition. And Biden was very incompetent in how he made his case, and Trump took advantage of that and became the new, more sort of closely aligned with the working class. And so that was how he won, largely because of the sort of failure of the Democrats on that. How do they get that back? It really, they do have to focus on making the main thing the main thing. I think one of the big risks is that they're still addicted to identity politics, and they're not as focused on how do I sort of address the kitchen table issues that people care about. Better, and Stephanie, to her credit, talked about a lot of them, which is like healthcare, education. I'm freaked out about AI and what it means for the future of the economy and my role in it. How are people talking about that? Growth, jobs, more prosperity in my community that I live in. And until they get back to addressing that, it's going to be a problematic, and they're going to continue to face problems. And for the internecine battles inside the Republicans, where it's like, these tech bros versus the new lunch pail crowd and the tensions there, yeah. But at the bottom line, if they're not answering growth, they're not bringing down inflation, they're not creating jobs, they're not making people feel better about the future, they're going to have problems as well. And that's really, I try not to complicate a lot of this, and I think that's where the next 2 years is. If there's one thing I'm going to be watching, it's that. It's the big middle of the American electorate and who can win them.
What's interesting, though, is during the campaign, Harris did not talk about identity politics, right? She never talked about being a woman.
1,000% disagree
Really?
with that
Well, Stephanie,
violently.
well, Harris herself. Now,
And
other
here's the
people
thing,
may
here's the
have.
thing. Harris may not have tried to, she was not top of line for her convention speech, or maybe her ads didn't do it. But we know that Harris was identified over the long length of her career, and her public profile was built around waging identity politics, virtue signaling. 100%.
I agree. We know that was her career, but she did not drill in on, hey, I'm the first female president. She didn't drill in on those facts. She just said, I'm running for everyone. She didn't, not during the election.
Doesn't matter. You can't invent a public persona in 3 months when you have 10 years of it.
Yeah, that was the problem that we had, that there was a whole record
I mean,
of
think about the
things
blue,
that
yeah,
she
and
did
just
as AG.
and just real quickly, it was like her identity. Everybody in this room would agree was that she is not aligned with 2A Second Amendment voters or gun rights voters. And so when you have an entire career defined around that, and then you say in an interview, but I own a Glock, the inauthenticity of that was the major challenge that she had with winning over these voters. And I'm not saying that as critical. I'm saying that any clinical assessment would bring it. It's the same thing as if Mitt Romney's like, hey, I'm a regular guy, let's go get a beer. A Mormon who lived in Boston and doesn't drink is not gonna get a beer with you. And I remember saying that, if this is an election about who do you wanna have a beer with, we're gonna frickin' lose. And we tried to make sure it wasn't that election.
But to Stephanie's point, she had a long career of activism in California.
Absolutely.
And in California, your activism is going to be very progressive. And so she had a record that she couldn't run away from, and she probably couldn't fully embrace. It was a difficult position to be in. We're going to go to a couple questions from the audience here, and I promise to get Stephanie out at a reasonable time. But while you think of your questions, I'm going to a quick one. So were you surprised, as I was, but maybe you weren't, that all three, Hegseth, Bobby, and Tulsi, are going to get confirmed, A? And B, if Matt Gaetz came back, if Matt Gaetz had been nominated tomorrow, would he get confirmed by this Republican Senate after what we just saw with these three?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking all three of you. Were you surprised?
I was genuinely surprised, and no, Gaetz is a special type of. I mean, the thing that was when that was announced, I almost couldn't believe it. I thought something had happened to Mike
We were
Tex.
in Oxford. Well, actually,
were you? I
yeah.
had a client then, and I was just like, I can't be right. And that is one where every senator who had a vote on that basically called the White House and said, you might want to rethink this one. And you got to remember about also the Senate.
Weren't a bunch of them, though, saying the same thing about Hegseth?
Yes.
And Tulsi?
But here, there's a big difference. On the Senate, on Hegseth, on Gaetz, the thing is, judiciary committee is a very special group of senators. Most senators wake up in the morning and they look in the mirror and they see a president looking back. Every senator on the Judiciary Committee wakes up, looks in the mirror, and they see an attorney general looking back. The idea that that job, which they all covet or want, or Supreme Court, that some guy from the House of Representatives is going to take the job. It's a no. I mean, I remember saying, I was like, there's no way this happens the second it was announced.
And then there were the
Not just
allegations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they
That
also.
too. I mean, like that was that, and that, right? So
Seth?
He's also a hated
Yeah, yeah,
member.
yeah.
I mean, he is an asshole.
Just plain English.
Plain English.
They're all adults.
Everybody's adult. So questions, I got to start with Seth's class because Seth's class has a special place here since we go way back. Right, Seth? Anybody have questions from Seth's class first? If not, that's okay. We'll go to the, oh yeah, here we go.
Well, I was just going to ask.
Loud enough for everybody in the room to hear.
Okay, so I was just going to ask. We can see with Trump's grabs at land, right? With Greenland, with the Panama thing, with Canada and other countries, right? You have the ever-looming threat of China over Taiwan or Russia literally moving the fences into Belarus, into Ukraine. Do you guys think that we're starting to see more of an era of like land shifting compared to the previous, 60 however many years?
No.
Do I think it will happen, or do we think he'll try to?
He'll try.
Yeah.
There's no way he can do it without, like, do we really think that Canada is going to be the 51st state?
No.
I mean,
Republicans would never get elected again.
exactly.
I mean-
or that Greenland's just going to be like, oh, or Denmark's going to be like, you're right, have it.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. And without some sort of military force, like there's no tariff law big enough for a country to give up their own sovereignty. So what's the alternative? How do you get it? Military force. Do you think the American people are going to be okay with us sending troops to Greenland to take it? Or down to the Panama Canal? Most people don't even know where the Panama Canal is. So
I heard it's in Panama.
they don't know where
Give it
Panama
away.
is, or the the necessity of the Panama Canal to our economy. So it just the idea that he thinks that, I mean, what it says to me is that he's got a Putin mentality where he can just take. Well, unfortunately, Putin runs a wholly different kind of country where people are okay with sending troops to take land. This is the United States. It's a different country. That's just never going to happen. So, it is, I mean, he also sees it as a sign of strength, where he just put these things out there as a sign of strength. Well, I think we should have this. I think we should go get it. And this person's preventing me from getting it. He's never going to get it, but he thinks it makes him look strong. So, I think, for the guy sitting on his couch in Dubuque, Iowa, who's looking for more money to go get a bear at night, that he's going to scratch his head like, what's in that for me? When is he going to do something for me?
I mean, it is. I think you touch on a little bit is the idea of expansionism of American excellence, that we should have more things, we should be bigger, right? We should expand the country. They aren't up for sale, but then you look at little wins that the administration has had, where like Google Maps has changed is changing it from the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, right? And so that does tell you, and other people are doing the same thing, and so what that tells you. What that tells the Trump administration is, we can keep pushing these things because maybe we won't get ownership over the Gulf of America or the Gulf of Mexico, but everyone's going to think we have it now, right? The name has changed or is changing when you go in Google Maps. Sometimes that's enough for the fight. I did an interview with the Canadian ambassador to the United States a few weeks back, 3 weeks, month. It's time of the flat circle, sometime after the election. And she was with Justin Trudeau when they were at Mar-a-Lago, and Donald Trump at the dinner table said, "You're the governor, and you're the governor of the 51st state of the United States." And I asked her, I said, doesn't that feel I don't know, disrespectful to the sovereignty of your country. And the way that she put it is, I think, the way a lot of leaders around the world are trying to game their conversations with Donald Trump. She said that she saw it as like a little brother needling a smaller brother, or a bigger brother needling a smaller brother, which is the way that they're thinking about these things now, right? They went through the 4 years of the Trump administration, and what they have gathered is that some of these threats never come to fruition, right? A lot of the tariff threats that during the first administration never went through. The tariff threats just recently didn't go through either. They have another month-long extension. Canada announced the thing that they talked about on Monday weeks ago, right? And so they had already said that they were sending troops to the border. That was a win they already had, but it was during the Biden administration. He wanted it to happen during the Trump administration. So they see it, a lot of these things, including the kind of land grabs that you're talking about, psychological warfare.
So
that they
what
have
they're
to
doing
deal
is
with.
tolerating him, which you never really want in your president, for other countries to tolerate them. But yeah, they figured out how to make him think he's got a win, even though he doesn't actually have a win. So not just Canada, but Mexico. Mexico committed more troops under Biden at the border than what they told Trump. So they have figured out how to manipulate his psychology to come out on the other end unscathed.
So much of this could be solved if we had like closed circuit television in the White House and we just like programmed in like, oh wow, Canada said they're cool with it. Like, great.
Okay, we got one here. Loud enough for everybody to hear, please.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much. This is such an interesting panel. I'm thinking back to the comments here in the audience and also this idea of identity politics. I'm struggling with the idea that the Harris campaign really put identity politics front and center because of some of the things I seem to remember about the debate, for example, where it felt like she was continuously being typecast and she sort of centered it back on issues, or maybe the Dem convention or something like that, where I felt there might be a broader set of speakers of different identities that were not included. And so that begs the question in my mind, can any candidate that is not shielded by a sort of veneer of whiteness or of a traditional like political upbringing not be typecast as playing identity politics?
Well, Barack Obama was probably, one of the best politicians of his generation because he appealed beyond the race issue. But I think you're wrong. I disagree with you that they did not showcase that. They did. The party has. If you do any focus group or you look at any of the metrics of how some swing voters were reacting, the ad that was run over and over and over in swing states and targeted at swing voters and actually mobilized a lot of Democrats to vote for Donald Trump was the they-them ad. And that resonated very strongly with people because it was at the heart of, they're not worried about the thing that I think is the thing. They're worried about this other stuff that doesn't tell me about like why inflation's not coming down, why there's not more housing, why there's not more this, why there's not more that. And so they just lost the plot on what was motivating swing voters. And you have working class Democrats that have voted for Donald Trump as a result of that. And the appeal, I also thought, was inauthentic in some of these blue collar Midwestern states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. These voters are more sophisticated than saying, I own a Glock, and look, I'm not out to take your gun, when the sort of broader sort of policy landscape indicates that they're not aligned with you on that. So I just disagree, and I think that it was one of the reasons that they lost.
But I think what you're saying.
Compared to the Trump campaign, that I think used identity politics quite deftly to.
Exactly.
Yeah, but please.
I see that. I see that point. I would
would
agree with you. I think they tried to use it as like, we're worried about the thing that's the thing, which you're worried about, which is the economy and inflation and all this. And they're worried about this other thing, which doesn't really matter. And so it's a little bit of a deft turn on knowing what it is that's driving certain voters away from their traditional Democratic coalition.
I think what happened with identity politics in this election has been something that's been building for a long time. It didn't necessarily, we saw the the fruits of what's been building and the results of this election. But the way Harris ran her campaign was not based on identity politics. That doesn't mean her record
Right, right.
and the Democratic Party's record of doing things to protect people. And we call this identity politics in shorthand. What it actually means is protecting the rights of everybody, not just those with power. So that, is now identity politics. Harris didn't run on identity politics. The convention wasn't based on identity politics for a very specific reason, because we saw the same numbers that Kevin's talking about what swing voters wanted. And they wanted somebody who cared about them and who was going to do something about the economy and fixing the country, not about what somebody's rights over here have been infringed upon or what we're expanding rights over here for this other population. And I'm not trying to make light of the need for those rights. I believe in those rights, but this was a numbers play. We saw where the electorate was. And all of these things come in waves, right? Just 6 years ago, we were in the middle of a huge wave of what you could call now identity politics, where Black Lives Matter, where the majority of Americans joined with them in fighting for the end of brutality against Black people by the people that are supposed to be protecting them. So this stuff has a cyclical effect. What we're experiencing right now is not how life is always going to be. Something will happen that will trigger something else. The economy, let's not forget, when Biden was elected, at the end of Trump's tenure in the White House, we were dealing with a historic pandemic that crushed our economy. Biden had to pick up those pieces. And I'm not trying to defend Biden, or I'm just trying to give some history. And the economy took a while to recover. His way of helping the economy recover is to put a bunch of money in the economy, to build roads, to fund programs. That, in part, led to inflation. And so people didn't feel that the economy was recovering the way the numbers showed that it was recovering. And that was a hangover for him. So identity politics in the midst of a bad economy, or what's perceived to be a bad economy, has a backlash against those identity politics, because people want their president totally focused on their pocketbook. So this, if the economy continues at the pace it's going, and the tariffs don't send us back into a recession, then this stuff could change. And something might trigger another backlash against the infringement of these rights. So, nothing is set in stone. There are always learnings from an election of things that you got to keep in mind, understand where the electorate is at that point. That's not where the electorate's going to be in 4 years. I guarantee it.
Okay, I'm going to make a deal with the audience and with the group here. Stephanie's a hockey mom. I told her she could leave at 7:30. It's 7:34. She's got her son to pick up. So, Stephanie, thank you.
Sorry,
We'll stay for a few more questions, the rest of us, and then we can have a conversation up here when we're done. But Stephanie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Do we have a question up here all the way up? Yes. Loud enough for everybody, please.
So
Thank you,
I'm gonna
Stephanie.
stand so I can speak a little louder and project. So one of the things that I think that you mentioned, Eugene, and that Kevin you touched on, and that I've been thinking a lot about is going back to thinking about Steve Bannon, and then thinking about how we have the ability for the conservative side of the House to communicate in a certain kind of way, and that's been really effective. And we've seen that for the past decade, I would say even, that the more liberal side of the House has not been able to seize on a kind of way in which to communicate that is as effective. And Eugene, you are a great communicator. And so maybe you have some advice or some thoughts about how we think about shaping the narratives that the liberal side of the House is going to need to be able to get really effective with, to be able to reach the messages and the key points that they want to kind of talk about. Because part of politics is shaping the narrative that you want to shape. So that's my question.
I don't know if I have advice, but I think I have some observations. And I think the first one is that you have to play on the ground that exists, right? And I think the game that Joe Biden definitely was playing was a game that when, Democrats and Republicans used to hang out after, votes in the back and smoke cigars. But that was not the world, and that is not the world that we live in anymore, right? And so every decision that was kind of made was from there, right? Was from this bygone era of bipartisanship and whatever that meant at the time. I think we're just in a completely different way, and Steve Bannon and Donald Trump understand that. They understand that people, one, have very short attention spans. That's why everyone's so upset about TikTok. They need that, that short, quick bite. And people want to. There's so much information coming, and so the way to get through that is typically by making people angry, or making them so hopeful that that overcomes the other side's anger. And I think that's where Democrats have often failed over the last few years, is trying to play a game that no longer exists. And during the first year of the Biden administration, the first year of a presidency is probably the most important, right? Mm-hmm. It's when you're probably going to get the most things done as far as bills are concerned. And it's also how everyone is going to view you. And I think in that first year, they were so, probably rightly so, we were in the middle of a pandemic, thousands of people were dying every week and millions around the world. And so they didn't want to go around and talk about the accomplishments that they had, right? They didn't want to go on a tour and talk about the infrastructure bill. They didn't want to go on a tour and talk about, the checks that were sent to people. One of the things I heard all the time from voters was that, and Black voters specifically, Donald Trump signed and sent me a check. Joe Biden did not. Joe Biden definitely sent a check. He just did not sign it, right? And I think the biggest check was from the Biden administration. And so what that tells you is that a lot of it was like branding, marketing, and trumpeting the things that you did. And they just did not do that. When we asked them about inflation, they laughed at us. Right? They said that it was never going to be a problem, that it was transitory, and that was a word that all of a sudden everybody was using in the Democratic Party, but they weren't talking about the things that they actually did. And so when the election came and you did focus groups, they would tell people, okay, they did this, 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 and this. And people were like, what? I've never heard that. 3.5 years into a presidency, and the base, I'm talking about Black voters specifically, the base of your party has not heard about the things that you've done for them specifically. That's crazy, right? And so you can't win that way. And so you have to break through, and you have to actually trumpet the things that you did despite what's happening around you. And that was something that they failed to do. And I think the thing they're working on right now, and what I hear from strategists and folks within the party, especially younger, Blacker and browner folks, is that they're worried that the party is going to be so scared about the identity politics and how it played out in the election that they're going to leave some folks behind, right? They're not going to talk about the marginalized communities as much as they want. I don't know if that's actually going to play out, but that is where the conversation is kind of going and on its way. And so if there's any more advice, it would be they have to figure out how to balance that. I moderated a forum for the DNC chairs a couple of weeks ago. Again, time.
That was literally last week.
It's good to be.
I was watching.
There we go. I'm glad somebody knows. But I asked them that, like, how do you balance that? And frankly, I don't know that any of them had a really good and had answered.
They did not have good answers.
And then the other question was, what does it mean? We asked more than two, just to be clear. But another question was, what does it mean to be a Democrat outside of Donald Trump? Right? What is the thing that makes you a Democrat? And they didn't really have an answer that felt authentic or really thought through, or something that wasn't focus grouped and hadn't been put together by a committee. And so that kind of lack of a center and a mission is also a huge part of why the Democratic Party is struggling. It's because if you don't know, and this is for all of us, right? Like if I don't know who I am when I go out into the world, how can I expect anyone else to believe the things that I'm telling them about myself? And that is kind of where the Democratic Party is right now.
Yeah, it was carefully calibrated just to not piss off the activists.
Right.
I would say, like, the way I would answer that question is, just real quick, is it's about, right now, it's a change between analog and digital and the professors and the executive producers. And Democrats right now have a very analog approach, and the Republicans have a much more digital approach. I think Democrats spend way too much time sort of like, what happened on CNN tonight, you know? And meanwhile, like Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon, they're getting like millions of hits, and they're really like constantly, and the thing is, they learn from Trump. Trump is the executive producer of this thing called Washington. And he's constantly programming like the next hour and the next outrage. And he's overwhelming his opponents because nobody can get a word in edgewise. They can't change the script, they can't change the tone, they can't change the tenor, they can't keep up with the cadence because he's constantly programming the next hour. And then the other thing is the professors versus like the executive producers is, you know, right now, if you were to, my guess is, and I don't mean this like a criticism, if you were sitting in the Democratic strategist room right now and they were like, well, how do we get this message out? They'd be like, got an idea. New York Times op-ed. We'll get a New York Times op-ed and like, right? And it's like, awesome New York Times op-ed.
Call Eugene,
and it's like,
put it in political.
The New York Times op-ed. Who are you persuading? Who are you changing? But like there's this like sort of like self-medication, and like they feel great reading it in their favorite newspaper, which is very well read by all of the intellectuals that they want. And like in the professor's conference room, they are the shit. But like everybody else right now is like the executive producers are the ones that win because they're thinking like Netflix, like how do I program the next half hour? How do I keep people in that? How do I get people binge watching this shit? And how do I keep them coming back? And what's the cliffhanger? And like that right now is the split. And I think you do have some people who do get the content creator and the digital and the executive producer thing in the Democratic Party. Problem is right now is that they speak to the most extreme voices. It's AOC and people like that. And so they're not exactly going to sort of help you reformulate the winning Democratic coalition, which is much broader than what they're selling.
But then the question on AOC and that, you know, the Jasmine Crockett's and the younger folks who are probably more, they're not Hakeem Jeffries, right? They talk much differently than him. Yeah. They say things that go places that kind of the old guard won't. The question is, for Democrats, do you double down on kind of the younger generation that does speak to the left that feels like the Democratic Party hasn't been speaking to them? Or do you try to cobble together this other coalition? Yeah. What they realized in the last election when they went with Liz Cheney and they went around.
Huge mistake, by the way, Liz
right?
Cheney thing. I was like, when it was happening, I was like, I can't believe they think this is a good idea.
And it didn't work. And they spent there was a lot of time talking about like, you know, we're all going to come together as a country. It's not where the country is, and so you have to.
Steny Hoyer voted for Kamala Harris, but the Steny Hoyers around the country voted for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. They honestly, that's why they lost. They're not losing because they don't have the AOCs voting for them. They're losing because they don't have the Steny Hoyers voting for them.
Last question, and then we can all retire up here to the exit signs and chat in the hallways. But we got to wrap this up. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I want to talk about
Nice and loud.
Sure. In a room that has many students, I want to talk about public servants and the impact of the fork in the road email. There's been a theme for me as I look at what's happened in the last 2.5 weeks of The Apprentice, where you're fired is the theme, the most important part of what happens. How many people can be put in a situation because they're a federal employee to either be told they have to leave or they should probably think about resigning, and then it's at every level. It's IGs, it's heads of boards that make a difference, as well as, you know, everyone at USAID is just basically told you don't work here anymore, you work over there. The treatment of the federal employee, I think I can't imagine any students in this room who are saying, man, I'm looking forward to being a federal employee. So there's just to me, it's on so many issues and across the board that it almost becomes a hum. And it's not the thing you can run out. It's all lawsuits. What can you do on that one?
I mean, I think people feeling like that that job, the federal employee, is not a smart job to have anymore, it's part of the point, right? Like I think that there is an installation of fear that this process, and that's why you do things like if you are an organization and you do things really fast, you know that creates kind of chaos and frustration and fear. That's why when you're at a big organization, people like to move slowly because they don't want people to be scared. They don't want to send a chilling effect. That's not what's happening. And so what that tells you is that the Trump administration, Elon Musk and Doge feel deeply that moving quickly, telling people this is not a place for you. One, maybe then people won't stick around and test that theory and do lawsuits, right? I've talked to quite a few USAID officials who have said basically, we're not sure who's suing. Right, we're not sure who is the wronged party. Is it us? We haven't been fired yet, so we can't sue anybody. We haven't technically been wronged at this point. Some of these people who tens of thousands, I think it was announced today, who are taking these buyouts, right, to leave the federal government. So that Donald Trump and Elon Musk can kind of do whatever they want with it. And so I think that is part of the point. Is not the federal job used to be a job where you did it for a long time. You got a pension. It was steady. You could, for many of them, you could work from 9 to 5, go home, kind of live around DC, and not have to be in the city all the time. You could raise your family off of that. And they don't want that to be the case anymore, right? They see it as how Donald Trump has talked about it for a long time, is the deep state, right? They see it as too bloated, that they're not doing the things that they say. The administration has said over and over again that they're wasting taxpayers' money. People disagree about that, obviously, but that's the way that the folks in power are operating, that this is all a waste of your money. And I think that for the folks that were thinking about doing it, maybe you should probably still do it. Those jobs at some point may still be there, or there will be a completely remake of the federal government and many of these agencies around Washington, D.C. in the way that they're thinking, right? One person I was speaking with last night, that was a date I do remember because it was last night. They said that they are telling their colleagues not to leave because if you just kind of, in their words, lay down, right, and just let them do whatever to this organization that you care so much about, there's no repercussions and it makes it much easier. And that the fight might be worth having because, again, like Stephanie said, these are agencies that weren't created by executive order. A lot of these agencies were created by Congress. And so there's a process that has to play out here. But if folks just, as they put it, lay down, right, then there is no process and it doesn't have to play out in the courts and then everyone can move on. And so I think that speed at which they're doing it, that is what is at the center of it, is making people feel like they have no choice. When at the end of the day, every day we have a choice about something.
Okay, I think we're gonna wrap this. We're gonna all walk up here and say goodnight. And so if anybody has a question for Kevin or Eugene on the way out, you can catch them upstairs. You can get their autographs as well if you like. Thank you all for coming.
Kevin's is worth a lot more.
It's been fun.